They say the first 24 hours are the most critical when someone goes missing. After that, the odds of finding them drop, inch by inch, like a rope slipping through your fingers. By the time the third day had passed, everyone had stopped saying the word missing out loud. Noah had disappeared on a Wednesday afternoon. It was supposed to be a quick trip to the woods, a shortcut home from his friend's house that he'd taken 100 times before. He was just 15, not the kind of kid to wander off, and everyone knew he had a good head on his shoulders. But by the time dinner had come and gone, and his room was still empty, our family's home had taken on a strange, hollow feeling, like we were the only people left in the world. The police were called, of course, and the whole town rallied to help. Flashlights cut through the darkening woods, their beams bouncing between the trees as people called his name over and over. I was out there too, my voice hoarse by the end of the night. The woods felt bigger in the dark, colder, the trees closing in until it felt like we were searching inside a giant, breathing animal. Every so often, someone would shout, found something only to discover an old, broken toy or a scrap of fabric that didn't belong to him. By the second night, people were starting to talk. They didn't say it directly, no one wanted to speak those possibilities out loud, but they didn't have to. The looks, the quiet sighs, the way everyone's voices turned a little softer every time they said his name. It was as though they'd already accepted something terrible had happened, even if they didn't know what. On the third night, I overheard a neighbor whisper to my dad, maybe ... the woods took him. I didn't understand what that meant, but the way my dad looked at him, his face tight and pale, made me think he did. Then on the fifth day he came back. It was early morning, just after dawn, when I heard a commotion outside. I stumbled downstairs to find my parents standing by the door, their faces a mixture of disbelief and something close to horror. Mum was crying, her hands covering her mouth, while Dad stood frozen, his eyes wide as if he was seeing a ghost. And there, just outside the door, was Noah. He was filthy, his clothes torn and stained with mud, leaves tangled in his hair. He stood there with his arms hanging limply at his sides, staring up at us with an expression that made my stomach twist. His eyes looked ... different. Darker, almost hollow, like he was looking right through us. Mum rushed forward, wrapping him in her arms, sobbing into his shoulder, but he didn't react. He didn't hug her back, didn't even blink. He just stood there, staring at something in the distance, his face expressionless. Dad knelt down, gripping Noah's shoulders. "Noah, where were you? We've been looking everywhere for you." Noah's gaze shifted, his eyes slowly focusing on Dad's face, but he didn't answer. He blinked, a slow, deliberate blink, and for a moment I thought he was about to speak. But he just looked away again, his eyes drifting back toward the woods, that strange, distant look never leaving his face. The police came, of course. They asked him all the usual questions: where he'd been, if he remembered anything, if he'd seen anyone. But Noah's responses were vague, confused, as if he were describing someone else's memories. He kept saying things like I was with them, or they showed me things without ever explaining who they were. When they asked him about the woods, his expression would change, a flicker of something dark passing over his face. And every time they tried to press him for details, he'd shake his head, his gaze shifting back toward the window, as if he were looking for something just beyond the glass. By the time the police left, everyone was exhausted. Mom kept saying how lucky we were, how grateful she was, but I could see the worry in her eyes, the way she glanced at Noah every few seconds, as if she didn't quite believe he was really there. That night I heard him talking in his room. I thought maybe he was on the phone, but as I got closer, I realized he was talking to himself or to someone else, someone I couldn't see. His voice was low, barely more than a whisper, and there was something strange about it, a careful, measured tone that sent chills down my spine. I knocked on the door, trying to ignore the way my hand trembled. "Noah? Who are you talking to?" The whispering stopped. There was a long silence, and then, slowly, the door opened. Noah stood there, his face blank, his eyes dark and empty. "No one," he said quietly. But behind him, on the wall, I could see strange marks scratched into the paint. Symbols, looping and spiraling, forming strange, intricate patterns that made my stomach turn just looking at them. "What ... is that?" I asked, pointing to the wall. He turned, following my gaze, and for a brief moment, a flicker of recognition crossed his face. But then he looked back at me, and his expression was as blank as ever. "It's nothing," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "Just something I saw." With that, he closed the door, leaving me standing there, my mind racing with questions I couldn't bring myself to ask. The days after Noah came back were strange and tense, like living in a dream where everything was just a little off kilter. Even though he was physically with us, it felt like part of him was still ... somewhere else. Mum tried to pretend things were normal, filling the house with the smell of pancakes in the mornings, talking to him as if he were the same kid who'd left that day for his friend's house. But Noah barely responded. He'd sit at the table, staring at his food, pushing it around his plate without taking a bite. At night I'd lie awake, listening for any sounds coming from his room. It was hard to explain, but I felt like I needed to be alert, like I was waiting for something to happen. Sometimes I'd hear him whispering in that low, measured voice, speaking words I couldn't quite make out, and I'd shiver, wondering who or what he was talking to. One night, I couldn't stand it any longer. I crept down the hall and pressed my ear to his door, listening to the soft murmur of his voice. It was strange, almost rhythmic, like he was chanting or reciting something. Just as I was about to pull away, the door creaked open, and I stumbled back, heart pounding. Noah stood in the doorway, looking at me with that same blank, distant expression. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice flat and expressionless. I swallowed, feeling my cheeks flush with embarrassment. I thought I heard you talking to someone." He tilted his head, studying me with those dark, unblinking eyes. "I was just ... remembering," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Things I saw ... out there." His gaze drifted past me, toward the window at the end of the hall, and for a moment he seemed lost in thought. Then he turned back to me, his lips curving into a faint, unsettling smile. "They're waiting," he murmured, almost to himself. "They always wait." Before I could say anything, he closed the door, leaving me standing alone in the darkened hallway, my skin prickling with a cold, lingering fear. The strange incidents didn't stop there. Every night the house seemed to come alive with faint, almost imperceptible sound scratches at the window, footsteps in the hallway, whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. I'd wake up to find my window fogged up, faint handprints smudging the glass, as if someone or something had been standing outside, watching me as I slept. And then there was the forest. Noah seemed drawn to it in a way that made my skin crawl. Every day after school, he'd slip out to the edge of the woods, standing just beyond the yard, his eyes fixed on the dark line of trees. Sometimes he'd stand there for hours, his body completely still, as if he were waiting for something or listening to something that only he could hear. One afternoon I went outside to find him crouched by the tree line, tracing strange symbols into the dirt with his finger. The shapes were intricate, looping in on themselves in ways that hurt my eyes to look at. I crouched down beside him, trying to make sense of the patterns, but they felt ... wrong, like something out of a nightmare I couldn't quite remember. "What are you drawing?" I asked, my voice trembling. He glanced up at me, his eyes dark and unreadable. "They showed me," he said simply. "It's a map ... for finding the way back." "The way back?" I repeated, confused. "Back to where?" For a moment he didn't respond, his gaze drifting back toward the trees. Then he looked at me, a strange, almost wistful expression on his face. "To where they come from," he murmured. "To the place that's ... not here." The way he said it, so calm and certain, made my stomach turn. I wanted to press him, to ask him what he meant, but something held me back, a cold, creeping fear that whatever answer he gave me, I wouldn't want to hear it. That night, I woke to the sound of scratching at my window. At first I thought it was a branch scraping against the glass, but as I lay there, listening in the dark, I realized it was too deliberate, too rhythmic. Scratch, scratch. Pause. Scratch, scratch. My heart raced, and I lay perfectly still, barely daring to breathe. Then, slowly, I turned to face the window. In the dim light, I could just make out a faint outline of face, pressed against the glass, pale and ghostly, its dark eyes staring straight at me. My heart stopped, a cold wave of terror washing over me as I realized who it was. It was Noah. But it wasn't Noah. Not really. There was something wrong about his face, something off about the way he was looking at me. His eyes were too dark, too empty, and his lips were twisted into a strange, mocking smile. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't respond. I could only lie there, paralyzed, as he pressed his hand against the glass, leaving smudges on the fogged-up window. His fingers traced a line across the glass, forming one of those strange, looping symbols that I'd seen him drawing in the dirt. And then, just as suddenly as he'd appeared, he was gone, leaving only the faint smudges of his handprints on the glass. The next morning I tried to tell my parents to make them understand what was happening, but they didn't believe me. They thought I was imagining things, that I was still shaken up from everything that had happened. But I knew the truth. I'd seen it in Noah's eyes, in the strange, hollow way he spoke, the way he stared at the woods like he was looking at something only he could see. Over the next few days, things continued to get worse. Noah became more withdrawn, barely speaking, barely eating. He spent most of his time outside, wandering along the edge of the forest, tracing those strange symbols into the dirt. Mum tried to reach out to him, to get him to talk, but he'd just look at her with that blank, distant expression, his eyes dark and unreadable. And then, one night, he disappeared again. It was just after midnight when I woke to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. At first I thought it was one of my parents, but as I lay there, listening, I realized the footsteps were too light, too quick. I crept out of bed, my heart pounding, and opened the door just in time to see Noah slipping out the back door, his bare feet silent on the floor. I followed him, moving as quietly as I could, my heart racing with a mixture of fear and curiosity. He moved with a strange, unnatural grace, his movements smooth and silent, like he was gliding across the ground. He didn't look back, didn't seem to notice I was following him, his eyes fixed on the dark line of trees just beyond the yard. He stopped at the edge of the forest, staring into the shadows, his head tilted, as if he were listening to something I couldn't hear. Then, slowly, he raised his hand, beckoning to something in the darkness. For a long, tense moment, nothing happened. And then, just as I was beginning to think it was all in my head, I saw it, a faint, shifting shape, moving between the trees. It was hard to make out, but I could see the outline of something pale and thin, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet on strings. Noah watched it with an expression of quiet fascination, his lips curving into a faint, satisfied smile. "They're waiting," he murmured, his voice soft and reverent. "They're waiting for us." I stumbled back, my heart racing, every instinct telling me to run. But just as I turned to go, Noah's head snapped around, his dark eyes locking onto mine. His face twisted into a strange, mocking smile, and he raised a finger to his lips, as if to say, "Don't tell." I backed away, my hands trembling, and slipped back into the house, my mind racing with 100 questions I couldn't answer. I didn't sleep that night, and when I finally emerged from my room the next morning, Noah was gone. My parents were frantic, calling the police, organizing another search party, but I knew it was useless. He wasn't lost, he wasn't missing. He'd gone back to them, whoever or whatever they were. The days after Noah disappeared for the second time were worse than the first. This time there were no signs of him, no leads, nothing. The police searched the woods, again combing every trail, every thicket, but it was as if he'd simply dissolved into the trees. Mum was barely holding it together. She kept busying herself around the house, scrubbing the floors, washing dishes that were already clean, as if she could distract herself from the emptiness left behind. Dad was quieter, his face drawn and pale, like he was bracing himself for the worst. But the worst part was that no one would talk to me about it. Every time I brought up Noah, their faces would tighten, and they'd change the subject. It was as if pretending he wasn't gone would somehow bring him back. But I couldn't forget. Not after what I'd seen. Each night, I found myself drawn to the window, staring out at the dark line of trees, my mind buzzing with questions I couldn't answer. I kept thinking about the shapes I'd seen moving in the shadows, the strange symbols Noah had traced in the dirt, the whispers I'd heard in the dead of night. It was all connected somehow, pieces of a puzzle that I couldn't fit together, no matter how hard I tried. And then, one night, I found something. I was in Noah's room, looking for some clue, some hint of where he'd gone, when I noticed a small, crumpled piece of paper tucked under his mattress. I unfolded it carefully, my hands shaking, and found a series of strange, looping symbols scrawled across the page. They looked just like the ones Noah had drawn in the dirt, the same twisting, spiraling shapes that seemed to pull at my mind, making me feel dizzy if I stared at them too long. But there was something else on the paper words, written in Noah's shaky handwriting, as if he'd been in a hurry. They watch from the trees. They know when you see them. Once you see, you can never unsee. The words sent a chill down my spine. I read them again, feeling a growing sense of dread, as if the paper itself was warning me of something terrible. But at the same time, I felt a strange, morbid curiosity, a pull that I couldn't ignore. That night, I dreamed of the forest. In the dream, I was standing at the edge of the woods, the trees looming dark and silent in front of me. I could feel something watching me from the shadows, a presence that was both familiar and alien, as if it had been waiting for me all along. I tried to turn away, to run, but my feet wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, helpless, as the shadows crept closer, swirling around me like mist. And then I saw them. Pale, thin figures, their eyes dark and empty, their faces twisted into strange, unnatural smiles. They moved silently, gliding between the trees, their movements jerky and stilted, like they were being pulled by invisible strings. And at the front of the group was Noah, his face blank, his eyes fixed on me with a cold, unseeing gaze. He raised a hand, beckoning me forward, his lips moving silently, forming words I couldn't hear. I tried to back away, to scream, but I was frozen, trapped in place as the figures drew closer, their eyes boring into me with a hollow, hungry look. I woke up with a gasp, my heart racing, my body drenched in sweat. The room was dark, silent, but the feeling of being watched lingered, pressing down on me like a weight. I glanced at the window, half expecting to see those pale, empty faces staring back at me, but there was only darkness. I didn't go back to sleep that night. The next day I was exhausted, my mind buzzing with fragments of the dream, images that I couldn't shake. I knew it was just a nightmare, just my mind playing tricks on me. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was something more, something real. I could still feel that strange magnetic pull, a sensation that seemed to draw me toward the woods, urging me to step into the shadows and see what was waiting. That evening I couldn't take it anymore. I slipped out of the house and made my way toward the edge of the woods, my heart pounding with a mixture of fear and anticipation. The trees loomed tall and dark, their branches twisting overhead, casting long, skeletal shadows across the ground. The air was thick and still. The usual sounds of the forest muted, as if the whole place were holding its breath. I took a deep breath, stepping forward, my eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. But the forest was empty, silent, its depths stretching out in front of me like an endless, dark abyss. I could feel that strange pull, stronger now, tugging at me, drawing me deeper into the trees. And then I heard it, a faint whisper, drifting through the trees, so soft I almost thought I'd imagined it. But it was there, unmistakable, a low, murmuring voice calling my name, repeating it over and over in a tone that was both familiar and chilling. I stumbled forward, my heart racing, following the sound through the twisted paths of the forest. The shadows seemed to shift around me, forming strange, twisted shapes that loomed out of the darkness, but I ignored them, my focus locked on that voice, that faint, haunting whisper. Finally I reached a small clearing, the moonlight filtering through the trees, casting an eerie glow over the ground. And there, standing in the center of the clearing, was Noah. He looked different now, his face gaunt and pale, his eyes dark and empty, like twin pits of shadow. His clothes were tattered, dirt and leaves tangled in his hair, and he stood perfectly still, his gaze fixed on me with a strange, unblinking intensity. For a moment I was paralyzed, trapped in his gaze, my mind racing with questions I couldn't put into words. But then, slowly, his lips curved into a faint smile, a smile that sent a shiver down my spine. "You came," he whispered, his voice soft and hollow, barely more than a breath. I took a shaky step back, my heart pounding. "Noah, what happened to you? Where have you been?" His smile widened, but his eyes remained blank, empty. "I've been with them. They showed me things things you wouldn't understand." A chill ran through me at his words. "With who?" His gaze drifted to the trees, his expression distant, almost reverent. The ones who watch. They're always here, always waiting. They see everything. I glanced around the clearing, half expecting to see those pale, thin figures from my dream lurking in the shadows, but there was nothing, only the dark, silent trees stretching endlessly into the night. "Noah, please," I said, my voice trembling. "Just come home. We can help you. We can figure this out." But he only laughed, a cold, humorless sound that echoed through the clearing. "You don't understand. I'm already home. This is where I belong." He took a step forward, his eyes locking onto mine with a strange, intense focus. "But they're not done yet. They need you too. Once you've seen them, they won't let you go." I shook my head, backing away, every instinct screaming at me to run. "Noah, stop. This isn't you. Please, just come back." But he just kept coming, his movements slow and deliberate, his eyes never leaving mine. His smile twisted into something dark, almost predatory, and I felt a cold, creeping dread settle into my bones. "You've already seen them," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "It's too late now." Before I could react, he raised a hand, pointing past me, his gaze fixed on something over my shoulder. I froze, a sick feeling twisting in my stomach as I turned, following his gaze. There, standing at the edge of the clearing, were the figures from my dream. They were tall and thin, their skin pale and translucent, their eyes dark and empty. Their faces were blank, expressionless, but their eyes held a cold, hungry look that made my skin crawl. They stood in perfect silence, their bodies completely still, their eyes fixed on me with a strange, unsettling intensity. I backed away, my heart racing, but Noah's hand clamped onto my arm, holding me in place. "Don't be afraid," he murmured, his voice soft, almost soothing. "They just want to show you what they showed me." The figures began to move, gliding forward in perfect unison, their eyes locked onto me. I struggled against Noah's grip, but his fingers were like iron, holding me in place as the figures drew closer, their faces inches from mine, their cold, empty eyes boring into me. The world began to fade, the darkness closing in around me, swallowing me whole. I felt myself slipping, falling into that endless, suffocating void, their whispers filling my ears, their cold fingers brushing against my skin. And then everything went black. When I came to, I was lying on the forest floor, my body cold and damp, the ground beneath me covered in leaves and dirt. For a moment I thought I was alone, but then I heard a faint, familiar whisper, a soft, murmuring voice drifting through the trees. I sat up, my head spinning, and saw them standing in a circle around me. Pale, empty-eyed figures, their faces blank, their movements stiff and unnatural. And at the front of the group was Noah, his face twisted into that strange, empty smile that chilled me to the core. He stepped forward, his gaze locked onto mine, his eyes dark and unblinking. "You're one of us now," he said softly. "Once you've seen, you can never unsee." I shook my head, stumbling back, but he kept coming, his expression calm, almost serene. "Don't fight it," he whispered. "It's easier if you don't fight." The figures moved closer, their eyes fixed on me, their cold, empty faces inches from mine. I tried to scream, but my voice caught in my throat, swallowed up by the darkness pressing in around me. And then I felt it, a strange, suffocating sensation, like something was pulling at me, draining me, drawing me deeper into the shadows. The world blurred around me, my vision going hazy, my limbs heavy and numb. I felt my thoughts slipping away, my memories fading, melting into the darkness, until there was nothing left but silence. I don't know how long I was in that darkness. Minutes, hours, days. Time had no meaning there. I was trapped, weightless, floating in that endless, empty void, my mind blank, my body numb. And then, slowly, I began to wake. I was standing at the edge of the forest, my hands hanging limply at my sides, my mind hazy and unfocused. The house loomed in front of me, its windows dark, its walls cold and unwelcoming. I felt a strange, instinctual pull toward it, like I'd been here before, like I belonged here. But something was wrong. I could feel it in the pit of my stomach, a faint, gnawing sense of dread that I couldn't explain. I took a step forward, my movements slow and deliberate, my gaze fixed on the house, and as I walked, fragments of memories began to drift through my mind, images of faces, places, things I couldn't quite remember, but couldn't forget either. I reached the door, my hand resting on the cold metal knob, and I felt a strange sense of familiarity, like I'd done this 1,000 times before. I pushed the door open, stepping inside, and found myself standing in the darkened hallway, my footsteps echoing in the silence. The house was empty, silent, the air thick with the scent of dust and decay. I wandered through the rooms, my gaze drifting over the familiar shapes and shadows, my mind a blur of half-formed memories and forgotten dreams. I felt like I was in a trance, moving without thought, without purpose, guided by some unseen force. And then I saw them, my parents, sitting in the living room, their faces pale and drawn, their eyes filled with a deep, hollow sadness. They didn't see me, didn't hear me, their gazes fixed on the floor, their bodies slumped and defeated. I opened my mouth to speak, to call out to them, but no sound came out. I tried to move closer, to reach out to them, but my body wouldn't respond. I was trapped, paralyzed, watching them from a distance, unable to bridge the gap between us. And then I felt it, a faint, cold sensation, like a shadow passing over me, a whisper in the back of my mind. It was the same feeling I'd felt in the forest, that strange, suffocating presence that had drawn me into the darkness. I turned, my gaze drifting to the window, and saw a face staring back at me. My own face pale, hollow-eyed, my lips twisted into a strange, unnatural smile. And then I understood. I wasn't alive. I wasn't here. I was one of them. One of the figures in the forest, a watcher in the trees, bound to that endless, empty void, drawn back to this place only to haunt it, to linger on the edge of something I could never truly reach. I was a shadow now, a whisper in the darkness, a faint, lingering memory of someone who had once been whole. And as I faded back into the shadows, I felt a strange, quiet peace settle over me. I was part of the forest now, part of the endless, waiting silence, my fate bound to that place for all eternity. And I knew that one day someone else would come, someone who would see us, who would feel that same pull, that same inescapable urge to step into the shadows and join us. Because once you've seen, you can never unsee. Some say the woods are quiet at night, but that's never been true around here. Our house was quieter after Noah and I were both gone, even though I could still feel our parents moving through it, quiet, hollow shells of themselves weighed down by the silence. They kept the windows closed tight, kept the curtains drawn at dusk, as if that would keep the dark out. I knew it wouldn't, though. Once you've seen the dark, once you've stepped into the shadows of those trees, the dark is always there. As the days faded to weeks, I could feel myself becoming part of that darkness, drifting, watching, always waiting, bound to the shadows like something forgotten. I could see the forest from my place in the dark, every tree, every winding path, each hiding its own secrets, all of them waiting. The others were here, too, moving between the shadows, their empty eyes fixed on the edge of the trees, their cold, silent presence a constant reminder of the pull that held us all. I didn't know how long I'd been watching when I saw the light, a faint glow, barely visible through the trees. It was a flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness, casting strange, flickering shadows over the twisted trunks. A figure stepped into view, moving hesitantly, their footsteps crunching softly on the forest floor. I couldn't see their face, but they moved with a kind of anxious energy, their gaze darting over the trees, their breath coming in shallow, shaky bursts. They were searching for something. Or maybe for someone. I felt a strange, quiet thrill, a pull, deep and insistent, drawing me closer to the edge of the shadows. The others felt it too. I could sense them gathering around me, their pale faces glowing faintly in the darkness, their empty eyes fixed on the new arrival. The figure stopped, their flashlight beam sweeping across the trees, illuminating the strange, looping symbols carved into the trunks, marks left behind by those who had come before. I could feel their confusion, their growing sense of unease, and I knew that familiar dread was settling over them, that creeping realization that something was wrong. They turned, their gaze locking onto the shadows, their eyes widening as they took a step back. The flashlight beam wavered, casting strange, twisting patterns over the ground, but I could see their face now, The fear etched into their features as they stared into the dark, as if they could feel us watching. One by one we stepped forward, moving out of the shadows, our faces pale, our eyes dark and empty, our movements slow and deliberate. The figure's breath caught, their body going rigid with fear, their eyes locked onto mine, as if they recognized me like they could see the echo of a memory, a faint, lingering shadow of the person I'd once been. I raised a hand, reaching out to them, my fingers brushing against the cold air, and for a moment I thought I saw them shudder, their gaze flickering between the trees, as if trying to make sense of what they were seeing. But I knew it was too late. They'd seen us. They'd felt the pull. And now they would be bound to this place, just like we were, drawn to the shadows, lost to the darkness, trapped in that endless, empty void. One day they'd be here with us, their eyes blank, their voice nothing but a whisper, their face a pale, empty mask as they joined us in the waiting, in the watching. The light of the flashlight flickered, then went out, plunging the forest into darkness once more. And in that darkness I knew they were ours,